I want to share with you some instances of the depression and the singular behaviors of Dr. Johnson. So here we go. My indolence since my last reception of the sacrament, this is Dr. Johnson writing, has sunk into grosser sluggishness, and my dissipation spread into wider negligence. My thoughts have been clouded with sensuality, and except that from the beginning of this year I have, in some measure, forborne excess of strong drink, my appetites have predominated over my reason. Interesting, my appetites have predominated over my reason. A kind of strange oblivion has overspread me, so that I know not what has become of the last year, and perceive that incidents and intelligence pass over me without leaving any impression. He then solemnly says, "This is not the life to which heaven is promised." And he earnestly resolves an amendment. So Boswell's commentary on it as well. Further down, this is just Boswell citing some instances of Dr. Johnson's peculiarities and his peculiarities of his behavior and his mood. Mood's too light a word. It's more than that. I have now, he says here, it was his custom to observe certain days with a pious abstraction, v. New Year's Day, the day of his wife's death, Good Friday, Easter Day, and his own birthday. He this year says, I have now spent 55 years in resolving, having from the earliest time been almost that that I can remember, been forming schemes for a better life. I have done nothing. The need of doing, therefore, is pressing, since the time of doing is short. O God, grant me the resolve aright, and to keep my resolutions for Jesus Christ's sake. Amen. Such a tenderness of conscience, such a fervent desire of improvement will rarely be found. That's Boswell speaking. It is surely not decent in those who are hardened in indifference to spiritual improvement to treat this pious anxiety of Johnson with contempt. A little further along. Dr. Adams told me, referring to Boswell, that as an old friend he was admitted to visit him, and that he found him being Johnson, he found him in a deplorable state, sighing, groaning, talking to himself, and restlessly walking from room to room. He then used this emphatical expression of the misery which he felt: I would consent to have a limb amputated to recover my spirits. He had another peculiarity of which none of his friends ever ventured to ask an explanation. So this is evidence of his possibly having Tourette's syndrome. It's been, a retroactive 250 years back, diagnosis by doctors, not me, of course. He had another particularity of which none of his friends ever ventured to ask an explanation. It appeared to me some superstitious habit which he had contracted early, and from which he had never called upon his reason to disentangle him. This was his anxious care to go out or in at a door or passage by a certain number of steps from a certain point, or at least so that either his right or his left foot, I am not certain which, should constantly make the first actual movement when he came close to the door or passage. This I conjecture, for I have upon innumerable occasions observed him suddenly stop, and then seem to count his steps with a deep earnestness, and when he had neglected or gone wrong in this sort of magical movement, I have seen him go back again and put himself in a proper posture to begin the ceremony, and having gone through it, break from his abstraction, walk briskly on, join his companion. That's the one I heard, and there's a kind of a formal term for that. I don't recall what it is. Here's another one. It is requisite to mention, this is again Boswell speaking, it is requisite to mention that while talking or even musing as he sat in his chair, he commonly held his head to one side towards his right shoulder and shook it in a tremendous manner, moving his body backwards and forwards and rubbing his left knee in the same direction with the palm of his hand. In the intervals of articulating, he made various sounds with his mouth, sometimes as if ruminating or what is called chewing the cud, sometimes giving a half whistle, sometimes making his tongue play backwards from the roof of his mouth, or if chuckling like a hen, and sometimes protruding it against his upper gums in front, if in pronouncing quickly under his breath, "Too, too, too." All this accompanied sometimes with a thoughtful look, but more frequently with a smile. Generally, when he had concluded a period, in the course of a dispute, by which time he was a good deal exhausted by violence and vociferation, he used to blow out of his breath like a whale. This, I suppose, was a relief to his lungs, and seemed in him to be a contemptuous mode of expression, as if he made the arguments of his opponent fly like chaff before the wind. And finally, the last one here. If the amusement of my company can exhilarate the languor of a slow recovery, this is actually different. This is actually Johnson. Sorry, but I'll finish it. This is a letter that Johnson has to a friend of his, Joshua Reynolds, who was very ill, and Dr. Johnson's writing to him. He says he wants him. Would you like me to come to you? I'll make you happy. He says, if the amusement of my company can exhilarate the languor of a slow recovery, I will not delay a day to come to you. For I know not how I can so effectually promote my own pleasure as by pleasing you, or my own interest as by preserving you, in whom, if I should lose you, I should lose almost the only man whom I call a friend. Such a generosity in a man who suffered so much. There's more. It goes on and on. Talks about him sitting by the window, talking to himself. Had quite a habit of talking to himself, of seemingly muttering prayer. Everybody thought he was muttering prayers, but he might in fact be issuing remembrances of Latin. Boswell goes on to note about how there was one of his friends had a very pretty wife. he referred to, you could hear him muttering about the temptation, although he was a very pious man indeed. Anyway, I'll stop for there. Good stuff.